The palace was designed for ceremony, not confrontation. Its corridors were measured in tradition, its walls lined with portraits that had witnessed abdications, coronations, wars, and reconciliations. Nothing here moved without precedent. Nothing shimmered without permission. And yet, on that evening, just moments before a state reception watched by the world, a single figure stood immovable in a corridor reserved for royalty. A royal guard. Ahead of him, beneath controlled lighting and centuries of expectation, waited a tiara, not merely diamond set in platinum, but a living fragment of lineage. Behind him approached Queen Camilla, dressed for diplomatic brilliance, unaware that history was about to hesitate. There were no raised voices, no dramatic gestures, only silence. A silence so precise it felt engineered, because within that silence lay a question no one had anticipated. Could duty override proximity to the crown? Could a clause written decades ago pause a sovereign path? When the guard refused to step aside, he was not defying a queen. He was defending a rule older than any living royal. And in that suspended moment, the palace itself seemed to hold its breath. The corridor was silent now, but the echo of that halted step still lingered in the air. Moments earlier, Queen Camilla had advanced toward the regalia chamber with the calm assurance of ceremony. The evening ahead was meticulously planned, a diplomatic reception framed by heritage, precision, and visual continuity. Every detail had been rehearsed, every jewel pre-selected, every photograph anticipated before it was taken. And yet, halfway down the private corridor leading to the tiara selection room, a single royal guard stood immovable. He did not raise his hand. He did not issue a command. He simply did not move. The chandeliers above cast a controlled amber glow against polished marble floors. Velvet ropes hung in still arcs. The scent of beeswax and old wood drifted faintly through the air, the preserved fragrance of a palace that had outlived empires. The setting was not dramatic. It was disciplined. Behind the guard, two junior officers mirrored his stillness. Ahead of him, the queen consort slowed. Aides halted instinctively. Silk whispered and then settled. Folders were lowered. Breath became measured. Protocol rarely collapses loudly. It fractures in quiet increments. Your Majesty, the guard said with bow of exact depth. Camilla regarded him steadily. Her posture remained composed, chin aligned, gaze level. Nothing in her expression suggested alarm, only expectation. He did not step aside. In that small absence of movement, centuries pressed inward. "Is there an issue?" she asked, voice controlled, almost gentle. The guard's reply carried no tremor. "Ma'am, I have been instructed to suspend access to the designated regalia chamber pending archival verification." The words entered the corridor like cold air through a sealed window. An aide's eyes flickered. A courtier shifted weight before mastering the reflex. No one spoke. Archival verification. It was not a phrase used casually within palace walls. Beyond the closed doors ahead, beneath a protective glass dome on a rosewood console, rested the tiara selected for the evening's engagement. Its diamonds were old-cut, arranged in a restrained arc of brilliance. It had appeared in coronation portraits, in transitional ceremonies, in moments where continuity mattered more than ornamentation. It was catalogued not merely as jewelry, but as a continuity emblem within the crown's regalia registry. And that classification carried conditions. Verification of what? Camilla asked, her tone narrowing without rising. Lineage-based authorization under Clause 7 of the Regalia Continuity Registry. The guard answered, Clause 7. The phrase did not echo loudly. It did something worse. It settled. A corridor designed for diplomacy now felt like a tribunal chamber. Princess Anne's approach was not hurried, yet her presence shifted the gravity of the moment. Her heels struck marble with restrained cadence as she entered the halted formation of aides and officers. She took in the scene in one measured sweep. The guard's unyielding posture, Camilla's composed stillness, the suspended air between them. What appears to be the delay? And asked. The guard inclined his head. Your Royal Highness, the tiara selected falls under restricted continuity designation. Sovereign confirmation is required during transitional classification. Transitional classification. No one defined aloud. No one needed to. The monarchy had recently shifted in form. Titles adjusted, roles recalibrated, public language evolved carefully. But within the archives, in ink and parchment, definitions remained exact. Camilla's gaze moved briefly to Anne. The selection was clear by the household, she said evenly, for presentation, and replied with equal composure, not necessarily for a continuity assignment. The distinction was surgical. Silence returned, heavier than before. The guard stood firm, yet there was no defiance in him, only adherence. His uniform bore the insignia regalia custodianship, a branch tasked not with personal protection, but with symbolic guardianship. Their oath was older than living memory, and stepped slightly closer to him. You understand the consequence of interrupting a senior royal ceremonial preparation, she said. Yes, ma'am. And you are prepared to accept disciplinary review if this clause does not apply? I am. There was no heroism in his voice, no bravado, only readiness. Camilla's eyes lingered on him a fraction, longer than etiquette required. What she assessed was not insubordination. It was conviction anchored in documentation. Produce the registry, she said at last. It must be reviewed within the archival chamber, ma'am. Then we shall review it, and replied. The procession shifted direction. Bootsteps resumed, now synchronized, as the group turned away from the regalia room and moved toward the secured archival wing. The tiara remained behind, untouched, beneath its dome, a silent witness to the pause it had caused. The corridor seemed longer now. On the walls, portraits of monarchs past observed the passage with painted calm. Some had ruled in eras of upheaval. Some had faced crises that threatened the very architecture of the crown. All had understood one unspoken truth. Symbols hold power only when protected. As they approached the archival doors, a coded panel activated with muted light. The guard entered credentials. A second officer confirmed. Steel bolts disengaged with restrained mechanical precision. Inside, the air changed. Cooler, controlled, filtered for preservation. Rows of velvet-bound ledgers rested within glass-fronted cabinets. Temperature monitors glowed faintly. The space felt less like a room and more like a vault of memory, and moved toward a secured cabinet labeled Regalia Continuity Amendments, 1974 Revision. The year alone carried historical weight, a constitutional scare, public uncertainty, internal recalibration of symbolic protections. During that period, specific pieces within the collection had been reassigned restricted designations to prevent visual ambiguity during succession shifts, and withdrew a ledger carefully. The pages were thick, edges gilded but worn. Ink flowed in formal script, accession numbers, coronation inventories, lineage notes. There it was, the tiara's entry. Amended classification. Continuity emblem. Direct sovereign line only during transitional periods. Camilla read the line herself. The words did not accuse. They defined. The clause beneath clarified further. Assignment permitted exclusively to individuals within direct hereditary succession during active or immediate post-transition phases to preserve symbolic stability. No mention of personal worth. No language of exclusion. Only structural boundary. And exhaled slowly. The clause was dormant for decades, she said quietly. Rarely invoked, but it remains active. Camilla closed the ledger gently. For a moment, the matter transcended personal implication. This was not about adornment. It was about architecture. The invisible scaffolding that sustained the crown's continuity across generations. Outside the archival chamber, whispers had begun to circulate among senior aides. Nothing overt, only subtle recalculations. If Clause 7 applied, then the guard's action was not interruption. It was compliance. Camilla straightened. Is there precedent for alternative assignment? She asked. Yes, and replied. Temporary substitution under ceremonial hierarchy, without continuity classification. The solution was procedural. Clean. Quiet. But the moment itself could not be undone. The guard remained at respectful distance, eyes forward, awaiting instruction. He had not sought recognition. He had prepared for reprimand. What he had not anticipated was confirmation, and closed the ledger. The tiara will remain in restricted designation, she said evenly. Select the sapphire circlet under open registry classification. Camilla nodded once. No visible resentment. No outward frustration. Only acceptance of structure. The group exited the archival chamber with the same composure with which they had entered, yet something intangible had shifted. The corridor that had refused passage now allowed it. As aides adjusted course and preparations resumed, the palace machinery returned to motion. A different tiara was retrieved, fastening secured, final glances exchanged. The ceremony that evening would proceed flawlessly. Cameras would capture brilliance. Commentators would praise elegance. No one beyond these walls would know that history had paused for documentation. But within the palace, the echo would linger. A royal guard had stood still. A queen consort had been halted, not by challenge, but by clause, and princess, and had reframed confrontation into duty. As the procession moved once more toward the reception hall, the narrator's gaze lingers not on diamonds, but on discipline, because in monarchies power may shine, but it is protocol that endures. Yet as the registry ledger was returned to its velvet-lined shelf, one question remained unsettled. Who had accessed the continuity file hours before the evening began, and why had the clause resurfaced now? The ceremony had proceeded without flaw. From the outside, nothing appeared altered. Cameras flashed. Diplomats smiled. Commentary praised elegance and unity. The substituted sapphire circlet shimmered beneath chandelier light, and the evening concluded in carefully curated triumph. But long after the final guest departed and the last carriage lights faded beyond the palace gates, attention returned to the vault beneath the velvet, because inside the royal archives, silence does not mean closure. It means review. The archival wing remained illuminated well past midnight. Lamps cast warm pools of light across oak tables, where ledgers lay open like surgical instruments awaiting interpretation. The air was cool, regulated to protect parchment, and binding glue older than living memory. Princess stood at the central table once more, sleeves rolled back a fraction, not informally, but with quiet readiness. Around her, two senior archivists and the master of the household maintained disciplined composure. At the center of the table rested 3 volumes. The Coronation Inventory Ledger, the Regalia Authorization Register, and the amended Continuity Annex of 1974. Each book carried weight far beyond its pages. Begin with chain of custody, and said evenly. One archivist adjusted her spectacles and turned to the tiara's accession entry. Inked lines detailed its transfer from a private family trust into crown stewardship nearly a century earlier. The notation was precise. Gift of the sovereign, held in trust for continuity functions, not for personal possession, not for discretionary display, for continuity. The difference mattered. Assignment history? And asked, the second archivist consulted the authorization register. A neat column listed temporary ceremonial grants, coronations, jubilees, state openings, each bearing sovereign initials in faded ink. Most were lifetime permissions issued during stable reigns. But following the constitutional scare of 1974, an additional column appeared. Designation, restricted continuity emblem, activation condition, transitional phase. It had been triggered only twice in 50 years, both times during immediate succession shifts. Clarified transitional definition and instructed, the archivist opened the continuity annex. The parchment within was thicker, bearing the embossed seal of the crown. Transitional phase, she read quietly, shall denote the period commencing upon sovereign succession and concluding upon stabilization of hereditary line representation in ceremonial capacity. Stabilization of hereditary line representation. The language was deliberate. The clause had been drafted during a moment of national uncertainty decades earlier. At that time, advisors feared that visible ambiguity in regalia assignment could signal instability abroad. Certain pieces were therefore bound explicitly to direct hereditary succession during transitional optics, not to diminish others, but to anchor perception. Anne's gaze lingered on the tiara's entry. The queen consort's role, she said carefully, while elevated, is not hereditary by bloodline. No, your royal highness, the archivist confirmed. It is by marital alignment. Another silence. In monarchy, language is architecture. The distinction between marital alignment and hereditary succession is not emotional. It is structural. The guard citation of Clause 7 had been precise. But precision does not answer motive, and turns slightly. Now the digital mirror. The Royal Archives had modernized certain records. Scanned replicas stored within a secure digital registry, accessible only by multi-layer clearance. It existed not for convenience, but redundancy. A junior equerry stepped forward, holding a tablet with visible restraint. Access logs show entry to the Tiara's continuity file at 14:07 hours yesterday, he said. 2 hours before ceremonial staging. By whom? And asked. The equerry hesitated only briefly. User clearance registered under senior curatorial access tier. That includes, and his voice remained calm, the chief archivist, the deputy regalia custodian, and temporary override privileges granted to master of the household during ceremonial coordination. The master of the household, standing near the far end of the table, stiffened almost imperceptibly. I did not initiate review, he said evenly. No accusation has been made, and replied. Only inquiry. The equerry continued. The access session lasted 6 minutes. No modifications recorded. Only viewing. Viewing. The word carried quiet gravity. Someone had examined the continuity designation shortly before the Tiara's preparation for assignment. Coincidence is rarely persuasive inside institutions built on precision, and closed the ledger gently. Confirm whether the guard received instruction prior to citing Clause 7. The equerry consulted a second log. No written directive recorded. Your Royal Highness. However, at 16:22 hours, a secure internal message was transmitted to Regalia Custodial Command referencing review recommended under transitional registry provisions. Origin. And asked, unattributed, routed through central system without individual signature. A pause. And sign within a palace that documents everything. The room seemed to cool further. Forward me the routing pathway. And instructed, as technicians began tracing digital breadcrumbs, and return her focus to the physical volumes before her. The Tiara's chain of custody remained unbroken. Its designation remained valid. The clause remained active. The guard had not fabricated authority. He had applied it. Hours passed in quiet examination. Margins were reviewed. Initials cross-verified. Ink compared for temporal authenticity. The annex bore no tampering. Its seal remained intact. Near midnight, a subtle irregularity surfaced. The archivist's finger hovered over a notation in the 1974 amendment margin. Your Royal Highness, the secondary annotation. And leaned closer. A small, nearly imperceptible line beneath the main clause read, restriction subject to sovereign reaffirmation upon stabilization confirmation. Stabilization confirmation. Has such reaffirmation occurred? And asked. The archivist scanned subsequent volumes. No explicit revocation logged, which meant the clause remained active by default, not forgotten, dormant, and dormancy can awaken without warning. Meanwhile, in a separate chamber, Queen Camilla sat alone for the first time that evening. The sapphire circlet had been removed. Her reflection now bore only the subtle marks of a long public appearance. She had not protested the decision. She had not demanded override. But reflection does not require protest. The interruption in the corridor had not been personal rejection. She understood that. Yet symbolism carries weight beyond legality. To be paused publicly, even within private walls, was to feel the architecture hierarchy in its rawest form. A knock sounded softly. Enter, she said. The master of the household stepped in. Your Majesty, review confirms the clause remains valid. Camilla nodded once. And the access log, under investigation. No conclusive origin yet. She rose slowly and walked toward the window, overlooking the inner courtyard. Moonlight silvered the stone. This is not about adornment, she said quietly. It is about perception. Yes, ma'am. If perception fractures, she continued, continuity follows. The master inclined his head. Meanwhile, beneath the palace, technicians traced the anonymous routing path. The secure message recommending review had originated from an internal terminal within the archival wing itself. Not from the guard. Not from Anne. From a workstation assigned to rotating junior archival staff. But the login credentials attached to the message had expired 3 years earlier. An old clearance, reactivated briefly, then vanished, and was informed immediately. She listened without visible reaction. "Contain this," she said. "No speculation beyond this chamber." "Yes, Your Royal Highness." The issue had expanded. What began as a halted corridor had become a question of internal access integrity. Not sabotage, not yet, but irregular, and returned once more to the continuity annex. Her finger rested lightly against the embossed seal. Institutions survive not because they avoid tension, but because they endure scrutiny. The guard's action now appeared less like isolated adherence and more like response to a subtle trigger placed within the system. But by whom? And why now? Outside, the palace grounds remained still. Public narrative slept undisturbed. Inside, documentation whispered. The tiara rested again beneath its glass dome, its diamonds refracting nothing but dim security light. It had not been worn. It had not been misused. It had simply reminded the institution of its own rules. Near dawn, and close the final ledger. "Until origin is confirmed," she said calmly, "the tiara remains under restricted classification. No discussion beyond authorized personnel." She paused, and discreetly commanded guard adherence. No ceremony, no citation, only acknowledgement. Because duty performed correctly often receives silence, not applause. As the lamps dimmed and the archival chamber sealed once more, one truth settled into the foundation of the palace. The registry beneath the velvet was not decorative bureaucracy. It was a living spine, and someone had touched it. The archives had been sealed again, but the silence they produced was no longer passive. It carried weight. By the following afternoon, the palace had resumed its outward rhythm. Meetings, briefings, scheduled audiences. Publicly, nothing had shifted. Internally, everything had. The anonymous access log remained unresolved. And so, a private council was convened, not in the grand staterooms, not beneath chandeliers, but within a smaller chamber paneled in dark oak, a room reserved for decisions that must be spoken plainly before they are recorded formally. Princess and entered first. She preferred to begin before motion did. The master of the household followed, then the chief archivist. Finally, Queen Camilla stepped inside, composed as ever, her presence steady but unmistakably aware of the undercurrent that had drawn them together. The senior royal guard was summoned last. When he entered, he bowed, not deeply, not theatrically, but with disciplined acknowledgement of hierarchy. He understood the gravity of being called into a chamber where policy, not posture, would determine outcome. The doors closed. No attendants remained. The room felt smaller than it was, and began without flourish. "Yesterday evening," she said, "Clause 7 of the Regalia Continuity Registry was invoked in a corridor outside the Regalia Chamber. The citation was procedurally correct." The guard did not react. Camilla's expression remained composed. However, and continued, "An anonymous internal system access preceded that citation by 2 hours. We are here to determine whether your action was independently derived or externally prompted." The question was precise. The guard met her gaze evenly. "Your Royal Highness, I received a secure advisory message referencing review under transitional registry provisions. It did not contain instruction. It suggested verification." "From whom?" Camilla asked quietly. "The message was unsigned, ma'am, routed through Central Custodial Command," and folded her hands lightly on the table. "And without that message, I would not have reviewed the clause," the guard admitted. "But once reviewed, I was obligated to act." There it was, the silence between commands. He had not been ordered to block the corridor. He had been reminded of a rule, and once reminded, he could not ignore it. The chief archivist interjected gently. "The digital access that triggered this review originated from an expired clearance tier, one dormant for 3 years. Reactivated?" Camilla asked. "Momentarily," the archivist replied. "Then terminated." No one spoke for several seconds. The palace was an organism of protocol. Access was layered, monitored, compartmentalized. Expired clearance could not simply breathe again without deliberate intervention, and leaned slightly back in her chair. This is no longer about regalia assignment, she said. It is about systemic integrity. Camilla's gaze shifted toward the guard. When you stood in that corridor, she asked, did you consider requesting direct confirmation from the sovereign rather than halting movement? The guard answered without hesitation. Under Clause 7, ma'am, the obligation rests with custodial command to prevent provisional assignment until confirmation is secured. Delay is preferable to correction. Delay is preferable to correction. A sentence built entirely on discipline. Camilla regarded him for a long moment. There was no hostility in her eyes, only calculation and perhaps recognition. You were prepared to be dismissed, she said. Yes, ma'am. And yet you did not hesitate. No, ma'am. Anne's voice entered again, steady and surgical. Let's address the clause itself. She opened a folder containing a photocopy of the continuity annex. The embossed seal had been replicated for internal review only. This tiara is designated as a continuity emblem, she continued, activated exclusively during transitional phases and reserved for direct sovereign lineage. Camilla did not interrupt. Transitional phases, and went on, are defined not by ceremony but by perception. Stabilization must be visible, not assumed. The room absorbed the implication. The monarchy had shifted recently. Titles recalibrated. Public understanding evolving. Stability existed, but perception is fragile. The tiara, Anne said carefully, was intended as a visual anchor during uncertain succession optics. And you believe optics remain uncertain? Camilla asked, and did not answer immediately. I believe the clause remains active until formally reaffirmed. The distinction was subtle. Camilla stood slowly and walked toward the narrow window overlooking the inner courtyard. Afternoon light filtered through leaded glass, casting fractured patterns against the floor. This is not a question of my role, she said softly. It is a question of what the public reads into symbolism. Yes, Anne replied. And symbolism does not tolerate ambiguity. The guard remained standing. Camilla turned back toward him. You did not block me, she said. You blocked a potential misinterpretation. He inclined his head but said nothing. The chief archivist cleared his throat quietly. There is more, he said. All eyes shifted. Within the original drafting notes of 1974, the tiara was described not merely as restricted, but as a continuity beacon. The language was metaphorical, but deliberate. It was to signal hereditary clarity during moments when lineage required reinforcement. Camilla's gaze sharpened. And you believe that moment applies now? The archivist hesitated. I believe the clause's dormancy ended the moment it was reviewed. A subtle shift passed through the room. Once awareness is restored, ignorance cannot protect. And close the folder. The issue now is twofold, she said. First, the integrity of internal access. Second, the formal status of the clause. Camilla returned to her seat. And your recommendation? And held her gaze. That the sealed annex be unsealed fully before council. Once done, it enters official record. Public clarification may follow. A silence fell, deeper than before. Unsealing an annex is not administrative. It is declarative. It acknowledges that a dormant safeguard has become relevant again. And if we do not unseal it, Camilla asked, then we operate in ambiguity, and replied, and ambiguity invites speculation. The guard shifted weight subtly, not from discomfort, but from awareness that his single decision had accelerated institutional momentum. Camilla's voice softened. This is not about denial, she said. It is about boundary. Yes, Anne agreed, and boundaries preserve architecture. Hours passed in measured discussion. Legal advisors were consulted. Succession optics reviewed. Historical parallels examined. In previous eras, similar clauses had prevented symbolic missteps during fragile transitions. None of those moments had become public scandal, because they had been handled internally. At last, and stood, I will request unsealing of the annex, she said. It cannot remain dormant once cited. Camilla nodded. Then let it be formal, she replied. The decision was quiet, but irreversible. As the council dispersed, the guard remained momentarily. "Your Royal Highness," he said to Anne, "if disciplinary review is required, it will not be," she interrupted gently. "You acted within code." He bowed. "And should clarification become public?" And added, "Your name will not, because guardianship does not seek recognition." Later that evening, technicians prepared the archival chamber for controlled unsealing. Documentation was photographed, witness signatures logged. The embossed seal will be broken officially, not in secrecy, but in record. As the chamber lights dimmed and security protocols engaged, a realization settled among those present. This had never been a clash of personalities. It was a collision between modern perception and inherited structure, between proximity to power and proximity to bloodline. The tiara had merely illuminated it in her private chamber. Camilla removed the sapphire circlet once more and placed it gently within its velvet cradle. Her reflection in the mirror was calm. Restraint, too, is a form of strength. And somewhere in the palace corridors, the guard resumed his post. Unnoticed, unnamed, unchanged, but the silence between commands had altered the institution itself. As princess and prepared to unseal the annex before formal record, she understood one truth. Once history is spoken aloud, it cannot return to velvet shadows. The seal was not broken in haste. It was approached. The archival chamber had been prepared before dawn, long before the palace resumed its public rhythm. Heavy curtains filtered the morning light into muted silver. Temperature controls hummed softly, preserving parchment and ink as faithfully as memory itself. At the center of the chamber, beneath calibrated lamps, rested the continuity annex embossed, unopened since its drafting session decades earlier. Silent until now, princess and stood at the head of the table. To her right, the chief archivist. To her left, the master of the household. Two legal witnesses observed without commentary. The queen consort had declined attendance, not out of distance, but out of discipline. This moment required procedure, not presence, and placed her gloved hand lightly against the raised seal. "Institutional record," she said evenly. "Annex unsealing under internal continuity review." The archivist nodded. A small brass instrument was positioned at the seal's edge. No dramatic tear. No theatrical gesture. Only controlled pressure. The wax fracture was sound so faint it might have been imagined, but it was final. The annex opened. Inside, the parchment bore tighter script than the primary registry. Margins were filled with annotations in a hand long retired. Names were referenced, not publicly, not ceremonially, but structurally. This was not a list of exclusions. It was a blueprint for stability, and read silently for several minutes before speaking. "The clause was drafted during a constitutional uncertainty," she said quietly. "Its purpose was not limitation. It was containment. Containment of perception. Containment of symbolic drift." The document detailed a fear prevalent at the time, that visual ambiguity in regalia could invite external interpretation of internal instability. Certain pieces, therefore, were bound explicitly to hereditary continuity during transitional optics, no matter how modern the monarchy evolved. A particular line drew her attention. "Under no circumstance shall designated continuity emblems be assigned beyond direct sovereign lineage during active stabilization phases, unless sovereign reaffirmation is entered into record." Unless sovereign reaffirmation, the archivist spoke softly. No reaffirmation exists within registry, which meant the clause had never been formally deactivated. It had simply slept. And turn another page. There, in smaller notation, were names of prior monarchs and direct heirs, recorded not for public release, but as architectural reference. No commentary, no judgment, only structural placement. Unspoken names. Names tied not to personality, but to bloodline geometry. The room felt heavier as the implications settled. This was not about Queen Camilla. It had never been about her personally. It was about the invisible mathematics of succession. Later that afternoon, and requested a private audience with Camilla, not in council, not in committee, but alone. They met in a smaller sitting room overlooking the inner gardens. Winter light lay pale across the trimmed hedges. A tea service rested untouched between them, and did not begin with documentation. She began with honesty. The annex has been reviewed in full, she said. Camilla nodded slightly, and it affirms the guard's interpretation precisely. The words were delivered without sharpness. Camilla's gaze did not waver. And the implication, she asked, that the tiara remained structurally bound to direct hereditary continuity until formal sovereign reaffirmation. Silence. Outside, a breeze shifted bare branches against stone. Camilla leaned back slightly, hands resting calmly in her lap. Then the issue is not rejection, she said. It is boundary. Yes, and replied, a structural one. Another pause. Camilla's voice softened, though it did not fracture. I have no desire to destabilize perception, she said, nor to occupy symbolism not intended for me. There was no bitterness in the statement, only clarity, and regarded her carefully. Your restraint preserved unity, she said. Had you insisted otherwise, the narrative would have shifted. Camilla allowed herself the smallest exhale. I understand the architecture, she replied. I'm married into it. The weight of that sentence lingered between them. To marry into monarchy is to inherit its ceremony, but not its bloodline. The distinction is neither insult nor privilege. It is structure, and spoke again more quietly. The guard acted within mandate. He will not be disciplined. I would not expect him to be, Camilla answered. For a moment, they sat not as competing figures within a hierarchy, but as custodians of its endurance. The annex also suggests something else, and added. Camilla waited. That stabilization is not merely chronological. It is perceptual, and perception is fragile. Camilla nodded slowly. Then perhaps transparency is preferable to rumor. The word transparency carried risk. Public acknowledgement of continuity clauses could invite speculation, but silence invites it faster, and folded her hands. I am prepared to formalize the ruling internally, she said. Whether it becomes public depends on necessity. Camilla rose and walked toward the window. The gardens below were still immaculate, unaffected by internal deliberation. Formalize it, she said at last, quietly, without spectacle, and stood as well. It will be done. That evening, the annex's contents were entered into updated registry protocol. The clause was reaffirmed, not amended, its language preserved, its activation acknowledged. No press release, no ceremony, no headline, just record. Meanwhile, the senior royal guard resumed standard rotation. No commendation was issued, no reprimand filed. His personnel file bore only a notation. Clause 7 properly executed under review confirmation. Within palace culture, that was recognition enough. Yet beneath the calm, one final question remained unresolved. Who had accessed the digital mirror first? Investigators continued tracing dormant clearance credentials. The expired login had belonged to a former junior archivist who had retired 3 years earlier. The credentials should have been fully purged. They had not. Someone within the system had restored them briefly, not to alter content, but to view it, and receive the update without visible reaction. Internal vulnerability? She asked. Possibly, the technician replied, or intentional prompt. Motivation? Unclear, and dismissed the technician. Because sometimes the origin of awareness matters less than its consequence. The clause had resurfaced. The boundary had been reaffirmed, and the institution had endured. Later that night, Camilla stood alone once more before a mirror. She wore no jewels now, no circlet, no tiara, only composure. There's a weight to what is worn, but there is a different weight to what is not. She understood now that the interruption in the corridor had not diminished her standing. It had clarified it. In monarchy, power is visible. Stewardship is quieter. Across the palace grounds, lights dimmed one by one. The archival chamber sealed once more. The annex returned to its controlled enclosure, no longer dormant, no longer unspoken. Portraits along the corridors remained unchanged. Painted sovereigns watched over stone floors that had borne far heavier conflicts than a halted step. Yet this moment would join their silent history. Because sometimes the greatest preservation of dignity is not assertion, but restraint. Now the ruling awaited one final decision. whether its reaffirmation would remain within palace walls or be spoken aloud before a world that rarely understands the cost of guarding continuity. The annex had been unsealed, the clause reaffirmed, the record corrected, but the true resolution would not be written in ink. It would be worn, or rather, not worn, in public. 3 days after the archival review, another state engagement approached, smaller than the previous reception, yet symbolically significant. Foreign dignitaries, international press, a stage upon which perception crystallized instantly. The regalia chamber was prepared again, glass domes polished, velvet cushions aligned, security codes verified. The tiara at the center of recent deliberation rested in its designated case, cataloged, restricted, untouched. Beside it, arranged with quiet precision, lay alternative pieces. Among them, the sapphire circlet previously selected in haste, now elevated from substitute to deliberate choice. Princess and entered first, not to inspect adornment, but to observe alignment. The master of the household stood nearby, posture attentive, all documentation updated, and asked, "Yes, Your Royal Highness." Registry reaffirmed. Internal directives circulated to custodial command. And public record? No public statement issued. And nodded. Silence can stabilize faster than explanation, provided unity is visible. Moments later, Queen Camilla arrived. There was no tension in her stride, no visible residue of the corridor confrontation. She greeted and with composed warmth, not performative, not distant. The selection? Camilla asked simply, and gestured toward the display. The sapphire circlet remains appropriate within ceremonial hierarchy. Camilla approached the case. The diamonds caught the overhead light in measured brilliance. It was elegant, dignified, and unbound by continuity restriction. Her hand hovered briefly above the glass. Then she withdrew it. "The continuity emblem?" she asked quietly. "Remains restricted," and replied. A pause, not heavy, not charged, but reflective. Camilla inclined her head once, then let it remain so. No further debate, no visible sacrifice, only choice. Attendants moved forward to assist with placement. The circlet was lifted carefully, secured into styled hair, adjusted with practiced precision. A mirror angled slightly. Camilla regarded her reflection. There was no diminishment, no vacancy where the other tiara might have rested, because symbolism is not weakened by discipline. It is strengthened by it. Outside the chamber, the senior royal guard stood once more at post. He did not anticipate acknowledgement. His responsibility had neither expanded nor reduced. Yet word of the annex reaffirmation had reached custodial command. He had been correct. Correct, but not celebrated. That, too, was architecture. As preparations concluded, and stepped closer to Camilla. "The narrative will follow what is seen," she said quietly. Camilla met her gaze. "Then let what is seen be unity." Their exchange was brief. It did not require more. Minutes later, the palace doors opened to awaiting dignitaries. Flashbulbs ignited in controlled bursts. The sapphire circlet shimmered beneath natural light, refracting blue undertones across polished stone. Commentators noted elegance, continuity, poise. No one mentioned absence. No one knew what had not been worn. And that was precisely the point. The ceremony unfolded flawlessly. Speeches delivered. Hands shaken. Photographs captured. Every gesture measured. Every expression aligned. Behind the spectacle, documentation rested secure. The continuity emblem remained in its velvet cradle, neither contested nor diminished. Its power lay in preservation, not display. Later that evening, once the final guests had departed and the regalia returned to secured cases, Princess and requested a brief meeting with the senior guard. They met not in council chambers, but in a quiet antechamber near the regalia wing. He stood at attention. "You acted within mandate," and said simply, "Yes, Your Royal Highness." "You understood the risk." "Yes, ma'am." "And you would act the same again?" A fraction of a second passed. "Yes," and regarded him carefully. Then continue. No commendation, no ribbon, no public citation, just permission to remain what he already was. He bowed once and resumed his post. In her private quarters, Camilla removed the sapphire circlet and placed it gently into its case. She paused briefly, fingertips resting on velvet lining. There is a particular gravity to what is denied publicly, but there is a greater gravity to what is surrendered willingly. She had not been stripped of symbolism. She had chosen stability over assertion. Across the palace, staff conversations shifted subtly. The corridor incident had faded into controlled memory. The annex's contents remained confidential. The digital access anomaly, though unresolved in origin, had resulted in strengthened internal security protocols. Expired credentials were purged, clearance systems recalibrated, layers reinforced. The institution had been tested, not by scandal, but by its own dormant architecture, and it had held. The following morning, an internal memorandum circulated quietly. Continuity Clause 7 reaffirmed. Restricted designation remains active pending sovereign review. Ceremonial hierarchy to be observed without exception. No names attached. No references to confrontation. Only structure. Princess reviewed the memorandum once more before signing it into record. Her expression revealed neither satisfaction nor strain. Only completion. The tiara would remain unworn, not because it was forbidden, but because its purpose was specific. Camilla's public standing remained intact, perhaps strengthened by restraint. The guard's role remained unchanged, anonymous, disciplined. Order had not been restored through dominance. It had been preserved through respect. That evening, as twilight settled over palace towers, the regalia chamber lights dimmed automatically. Security sensors activated with quiet efficiency. Velvet absorbed the last glint of diamond fire. History does not always roar. Sometimes it pauses, and then continues. And as ceremony gave way to reflection, one final question lingered quietly in the marble corridors. What does it truly cost to guard history when no one sees the weight being carried? The ceremony was flawless. The photographs archived. The commentary archived. The evening absorbed into the steady rhythm of monarchy. But beneath the polished surface of public continuity, something quieter endured. In the regalia chamber, behind reinforced glass and calibrated light, the continuity emblem remained exactly where it had always belonged, resting, not rejected, preserved, not diminished, because the crown does not belong to those who wear it. It belongs to those who understand it. Morning light filtered gently through tall windows lining the inner corridor, the same corridor that, days earlier, had refused passage. Now it was empty again, still, measured, unremarkable, as if nothing had happened, and perhaps in the public sense, nothing had. Yet institutions are not shaped only by crises. They are shaped by restraint. Princess had moved through the corridor alone, her pace unhurried. She did not pause where the guard had once stood immovable. She did not need to. The memory of that moment lived not in stone, but in record. The annex had been resealed after reaffirmation, its status no longer dormant but clearly codified. The system vulnerability had been closed, expired credentials purged, internal review concluded. No scandal, no fracture, only reinforcement. In her private chamber, Queen Camilla reviewed the week's engagement schedule, diplomatic visits, charitable appearances, cultural patronage events. The monarchy would continue, because it always must. Her reflection in the mirror was calm, unadorned by spectacle. The interruption in the corridor had not altered her role. It had clarified its boundaries. And boundaries are not barriers. They are definitions. Across the palace grounds, the senior royal guard stood his post beneath an overcast sky, his uniform immaculate, his posture unyielding. Tourists beyond the gates would never know his name. They would photograph ceremony, not custodianship. But monarchy is sustained not by visibility. It is sustained by those willing to enforce invisible lines. The crown is often mistaken for power. In truth, it is stewardship. Every jewel cataloged, every sash recorded, every emblem annotated with lineage and limitation. Nothing exists in isolation from history. The continuity emblem, the tiara that had ignited the pause, was never designed to glorify an individual. It was designed to anchor perception during fragile transitions. a visual assurance that bloodline geometry remained intact. It did not accuse. It did not exclude. It simply defined. In the quiet of the archival wing, the chief archivist adjusted a temperature gauge and logged routine readings. The annex lay sealed once more, but not forgotten. Its reaffirmation had entered official registry. Future custodians would see the notation and understand that at one moment in time, the clause had awakened and been honored. That is how institutions survive, not through dramatic confrontation, but through adherence when adherence is inconvenient. Princess paused briefly outside the regalia chamber doors. Her expression remained composed, yet contemplative. She had spent her life inside this architecture, born into it, disciplined by it, entrusted with its preservation. Popularity had never been her mandate. Stability had. The week's events had tested that balance. Not between people, but between proximity and principle. Inside the chamber, velvet absorbed the light once more. The tiara's diamonds caught no applause. They required none, because symbolism does not demand display to retain meaning. Later that evening, Camilla joined in for a brief walk along the palace's inner colonnade. No aides accompanied them. No cameras lingered. They walked in silence for several moments before Camilla spoke. "It was never about the tiara," she said softly. "No," and replied, "It rarely is." Camilla allowed a faint, measured smile. The public would not understand the distinction. They are not required to, and answered. They are required to see continuity. They continued walking. The sky above the courtyard shifted from gray to deepening blue. Lights illuminated stone arches that had witnessed centuries of negotiation, celebration, uncertainty. In that fading light, hierarchy did not feel oppressive. It felt structured. Camilla stopped briefly, resting her hand against a cool stone balustrade. "There is weight," she said quietly, "in what one chooses not to claim," and regarded her with measured respect. "Yes," she said, "and greater weight in protecting what one cannot claim." The moment passed without sentimentality, because reverence does not require drama. Across the palace grounds, the guard shift ended. Another officer replaced him. The corridor would continue to be watched. The registry would continue to be guarded. The architecture would endure. History is rarely rewritten by those who seek to wear it. It is preserved by those who refuse to bend it. The camera of memory drifts upward now. Beyond corridors, beyond velvet chambers, beyond jeweled cases resting in controlled silence. It rises above towers etched against twilight sky, above gates where ceremony dazzles, above walls that have held secrets, clauses, annexes, and unspoken names. What remains is not confrontation, not controversy, but continuity. The crown is not a prize. It is a custodianship passed from generation to generation, sometimes visibly, sometimes in quiet restraint. Princess and embodied that discipline. The guard represented its anonymous devotion. Queen Camilla demonstrated that dignity within hierarchy strengthens rather than fractures it. And the tiara, unworn yet undiminished, became something more than ornament. It became a reminder that power may glitter, but stewardship endures. As night settles fully over the palace, lights dim in calculated sequence. Security systems engage. Ledgers rest. Velvet absorbs the final glint of diamond light. Tomorrow, engagements will resume. Speeches will be delivered. Ceremonies will unfold without interruption. The world will see brilliance. It will not see the claws that guarded it, but within the quiet architecture of monarchy, those who serve understand. The crown does not belong to the one who reaches for it. It belongs to the one who protects its meaning. And tomorrow, we uncover the night a single unsigned letter nearly altered the line of succession forever.